Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com. Mark Twain said, "There's something fascinating about science. One gets such wholesale returns of conjecture out of such a trifling investment of fact." 2 years ago, the BBC reported, "Climate change, bigger hurricanes are now more damaging." The biggest and most damaging hurricanes are now 3 times more frequent than they were 100 years ago, say researchers. And the Associated Press reported, "Big destructive hurricanes are hitting the U.S. 3 times more frequently than they did a century ago, according to a new study." Wow, that sounds really bad. We must have really messed the climate up driving our fossil-fueled powered vehicles. But there's a little problem. 3 years earlier, the Washington Post reported the exact opposite. They said the U.S. coast is experiencing an unprecedented hurricane drought, and they were terrified by it. Hurricanes large and small have eluded U.S. shores for record lengths of time. 3 historically unprecedented droughts and landfalling U.S. hurricanes are presently active. A major hurricane hasn't hit the U.S. Gulf or East Coast in more than a decade. The streak has reached 3,937 days, longer than any previous drought by nearly 2 years. The Washington Post is terrified when the U.S. does get hurricanes, and they're also terrified when the U.S. doesn't. So the U.S. recently had the longest period on record without a major hurricane strike. But researchers say that major hurricanes are hitting the U.S. 3 times more often than they did a century ago. According to the press, there were no major hurricanes for more than 10 years, and that was 3 times as often as a century ago. These researchers seem to be having a little bit of difficulty with mathematics. What is 0 divided by 3? Now let's try using the old method of research, looking at the actual data. This list from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration shows the deadliest Atlantic tropical cyclone since 1492. This list is 25 years old and has changed somewhat since it was published in 1996. For example, it doesn't include Hurricane Katrina. The rankings have changed slightly, but that won't have much impact on the storms I'm discussing in this video. 3 of the 10 deadliest occurred during the Revolutionary War, including the deadliest in 1780, which killed more than 20,000 people. And 9 of the 35 deadliest, shown here in red, occurred right around the time of the American Revolution. This was during the Little Ice Age, which was the coldest period of the last 8,000 years. It's pretty clear that large damaging hurricanes have no correlation with warmer temperatures. The 1780 hurricane, which killed more than 20,000 people, destroyed every single structure in Barbados. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration reported the wind blew so strong that it stripped the bark off the trees. Meteorologists are of the opinion that this effect is produced on wind velocities of over 200 miles per hour. An earthquake was felt during the passage of the Great Hurricane. The noise was so deafening that people could not hear their own voices. British Admiral Rodney wrote that the wind carried aloft 100 feet the heavy cannons of the ground fortifications. Now let's look at the 1772 hurricane at St. Croix. Virginia Gazette, October 19, 1772. St. Croix, September 4th. On Monday night last blew the most violent hurricane that has ever been known here, or perhaps on any island in the memory of man. Alexander Hamilton lived in St. Croix at that time, and he wrote this. It seemed as if a total dissolution of nature was taking place, the roaring of the sea and wind. Fiery meteors flying about it in the air, the prodigious glare of almost perpetual lightning. The crash of the falling houses and the ear-piercing shrieks of the distressed were sufficient to strike astonishment into angels. That's a pretty vivid description by Alexander Hamilton of a Little Ice Age hurricane. Now let's look at the deadliest storms in the Pacific Ocean. 9 of the 10 deadliest occurred with carbon dioxide levels below 350 parts per million, including 2 in 1881. The 3rd deadliest Pacific storm occurred in the year 1780, which is also the year of the deadliest Atlantic hurricane. And this was right in the middle of the Little Ice Age. Now let's look at the deadliest U.S. hurricanes. 8 of the 10 deadliest U.S. hurricanes occurred before the year 1930, with the deadliest occurring in the year 1900, and 2 of the 10 deadliest occurring in the year 1893. The United States was hit by three major hurricanes during the year 1893. The description of these 1893 hurricanes, which killed thousands of people, were absolutely horrific. The current claims that large damaging hurricanes are occurring more often are not based on science, and they're not based on history. The only group of people who are more ignorant about history and science than journalists and academics are politicians. 2 years ago, Governor Cuomo said that New York never used to have hurricanes. As is typically the case with Governor Cuomo, he had no clue what he was talking about. The most powerful hurricane to hit New York happened 200 years ago in 1821. The Norfolk, Long Island hurricane of 1821 surged up the eastern seaboard, creating chaos and wreaking havoc from the Outer Banks of North Carolina all the way up to the Boston metropolitan area. If this hurricane was measured by today's standards, it would be a strong Category 4 storm, unlike anything the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast have recently seen or experienced. The only thing that saved Lower Manhattan from being completely destroyed is that the storm came in at low tide. Even so, the damage done is immense, both on shore and to the shipping on the coast, and a great number of lives have been lost. And then there was the 1938 hurricane, which made landfall just east of the city on Long Island. That hurricane produced a 30-foot storm surge and was the deadliest in New England history. My mother remembered looking out the window of her apartment in Brooklyn and seeing trees bent over all the way to the ground from the wind. The deadliest U.S. hurricane occurred in the year 1900 when the city of Galveston, Texas was almost destroyed. 10,000 people lost their lives in that storm. Because of the constant stream of misinformation about climate from politicians, academics, and the press, many members of the public are unaware of how difficult the climate has always been. CNN shows scenes from a disaster over and over again, and they tell people that it's unprecedented. That sort of disinformation campaign causes people to become unaware that this sort of weather has always occurred. I'm going to finish this up with a review of some of the more horrific weather from the year 1890 to the year 1900. During the first week of May 1890, massive forest fires were everywhere in Minnesota and Wisconsin. And then a few weeks later were some of the largest forest fires in New Mexico and Colorado history. In 1893, the United States was hit by three major hurricanes, including 2 of the 10 deadliest. During January of 1896, Southeast Australia was hit by their worst heat wave on record. And later that year in 1896, 1,500 people died from the heat in New York City. Many of the dead were poor people living in tenements. Democrats call a low CO2 climate without air conditioning social justice, but I think that the poor people who died in New York in 1896 might have disagreed. Then during February 1898, right after Valentine's Day, 3 million acres of forest in South Carolina burned. Later that year in 1898, Oregon set their all-time temperature record of 119 degrees, and they hit that twice that summer, once in July and once in August. Oregon never got that hot during last week's claimed record heat wave. Later in 1898, massive forest fires hit Wisconsin and Colorado. The 1898 fires in Colorado were probably the most extensive on record. And then in 1900 came the deadliest hurricane in U.S. history at Galveston. Of course, there were thousands of other horrific weather events during that decade, but I've just covered some of the worst here. George Orwell said, "The most effective way to destroy people is to deny and obliterate their own understanding of their history." The press and social media are actively engaged in an effort to do just that. Twitter is reporting today, wildfire season in the western U.S. and Canada has started. The 2021 wildfire season is poised to be potentially one of the most active fire seasons. They want people to believe that wildfires are coming earlier and they're larger than they used to be. But one of the largest wildfires in U.S. history occurred during February 1898. And there were fires everywhere in Minnesota and Wisconsin during the first week of May 1890. The actual data from the National Interagency Fire Center shows that burn acreage so far this year has been well below average and is one of the lowest of the past decade. It's about 1/3 of what it was 10 years ago. The 1.5 million acres which has burned so far this year is just over 1% of the typical burn acreage during the pre-industrial period. This document is the 2001 Federal Wildland Fire Management Policy. It was written by the Department of the Interior, Agriculture, Energy, Defense, Commerce, the EPA, FEMA, and the National Association of State Foresters. It said, historically fire has been a frequent and major ecological factor in North America. In the conterminous United States during the pre-industrial period, 1500 to 1800, an average of 145 million acres burned annually. Today it's only 14 million acres. So far this year there's been 1.5 million acres burned. That is just over 1% of the pre-industrial average. One might assume that the press and politicians want the public to know accurate information about fires and climate. But the Biden administration has done the exact opposite. Sometime in the past few months, they deleted this document from the National Interagency Fire Center website. The Biden administration has an agenda to create fear about climate, and factual information works against their agenda. So they are erasing history. This document is just one of many important climate documents which have been erased by the current administration. In 1907, the U.S. Weather Bureau's monthly weather review contained this article. Is not honesty the wisest policy? It is wrong to mutilate or suppress the record of an observation of a phenomenon of nature, but it's also wrong to make a bad use of the record. In fact, it is the misuse of meteorological data, not the observing or publishing, that constitutes a crime against the community. Observation and careful research are to be encouraged as useful. Misrepresentations are to be avoided as harmful. The independent press, as the voice of the people, should be not only vox populi, but vox dei, repressing all cheats and hoaxes, defending the truth and the best interests of the whole nation as against the self-interest of a few. The Biden administration is engaged in a crime against the community of the type described in 1907. And it's up to the independent press, which are now bloggers like me, to defend the truth and the best interests of the whole nation against the self-interests of a few. Toto has been pulling back the curtain on this sort of junk science for the past 13 years. You can visit him, Kyrie, and Caesar on the web at realclimatescience.com.